You're listening to Sacks in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sacks in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at sacksinthebasement.com. Ryan Fuller, co-hitting coach for the Orioles, has been hired away reportedly by the White Sox and likely becomes the director of hitting. So Chris Getz, that's the big news, on Tuesday, seems to be installing his Brian Bannister of hitting, which is something we've talked about they need. And we're going to talk a lot today about what it looks like Chris Getz is trying to do, because at least he's trying to do things differently. I'm going to start this episode off with a voting story, because when you have a microphone, Ed,
as you do,
and you've got a bunch of people that listen to you on the microphone, and you feel as though if you said something to anybody else, it would just be ignored. This is one of those few moments where I want to tell this story, because it's a true story of something that happened to me going and voting today that should be shared and should really bother most of you. Although it was surprising me that nobody was bothered at the moment that it was happening. I went to my polling place, and as I approached my polling place, I got two guys, and I'm not going to get into politics here, I'm not picking a side. I got two guys with the same candidate, and they're standing at the door trying to hand me a flyer to tell them to go in and vote. And I go, no, I don't want that. And trust me, it doesn't matter which candidate or what party with me. I just don't want that because I've already made up my mind. I'm not making a decision off of the guy who hands me the little card as I walk in. And if you're making a decision that way, you shouldn't be voting.
Anyway, no, you should really have an idea before you go
if you walk up
to
and
the
you're
polling place what you're doing.
I wonder what I'm going to do today. Oh, look at this. It's shiny. It's fancy. It's on a card. That's my vote. Oh, my God. That just bothers me. And people do it that way. So they're standing there, and I go, no. And I go, shouldn't you guys be further away than the door? And they both laughed at me. And I was like, all right, laugh. And I said it just like that. And I walked in, and I walk right up to the table. And it only takes me 10 steps to get to the table to get my card from the doorway where these guys were standing. And I walk in, and I ask for my ballot. And as they're getting me the little card to go over to the little touch screen thing, I look down, and here are example voting flyers from one particular party laid out on the table, Ed, where I get my ballot. Now, I know you're not supposed to be able to do that.
So there's basically a guide ballot that says, here's how you vote for this party, sitting on the table.
Yes, at the table where I get my ballot. A bunch of them laid out, sprayed across it like a display. Welcome to voting. Here's who you're voting for. Take your ballot. And by the way, we put a handy guide right here on the table. Now, I know that's illegal. I know that's illegal.
Yeah.
So now I'm like, and I'm looking around the room, and other people see it. Nobody has said a thing. It's not like I'm the only person in there. It's a crowded polling place. And so I look at the person who's giving it to me. I'm like, hey, before I go vote, are you supposed to have all this on the table? And she goes, what? I said, the guide to vote for certain people at the same place where I pick up the, I'm not an election law expert, but I'm pretty sure that's illegal. So now she springs into action. Now, it's nice that she springs into action, but did you really have to wait till somebody complained to spring into action? I got there at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. You've been open for a couple hours. I wish you would have sprung into action sooner. And she starts collecting them. I hear another election judge in the room go, why are you picking those up? And before I can say, because it's illegal and obviously you're the jerk in here that's breaking the law,
right?
She turned to him and she goes, honest to goodness, she goes, somebody complained, we have to pick them up. It's clear the election judges at the polling place were aware of the flyers and aware of the guy at the door. And nobody, and probably even encouraged it, but I don't know. And now that I've complained, the flyers were picked up and the people at the door were made to go stand on the other side of the street. And I'm standing there like, why did it take the loudmouth? Because I'm a loudmouth. Like if I see something,
kidding.
I say something.
Yeah.
You know
why
this.
did it take you?
I'm the guy that walks up and goes, that's wrong, or gives his opinion, or tells somebody who's out of pocket to shut up. Like I'm that guy. And sometimes that works out well for me. Or some people think that's amazing. Like, oh, man, I wish I could just wear my heart on my sleeve and just say it how it is, Chris. And I go, well, you get punched sometimes for that. But like, that's what my life has been for 47 years.
You don't always benefit.
No, you don't always benefit
from that kind of thing.
But that's what I am. And it took me walking in and seeing this and saying something for something to change. Now, I'm sure 20 minutes after I left, it was all
they were right back up there. I mean,
this is America. This is why, people sit around and they go, how can anybody be convinced that the system is broken? Because everybody walks around and sees crap like this. That's the problem. It's not a political show. I'm going to move on to the White Sox. But man, I'm sorry. I had to tell that story because that is crazy. It should never be that way. I would call somebody and tell them about it and file a report, but I'm pretty sure nobody would follow up. And that's what sucks about the whole thing. It seems as though there's even more accountability right now within the White Sox than there is when it comes to my polling, and that's scary.
Yeah, I mean, I joked about them handing out pre-printed ballots when I went to vote because I did some early voting, but I didn't think that was actually happening. And now my question is, which person in the White Sox do we complain that something's going wrong, that they'll go and make changes and sit there and go, yeah, but somebody complained? Because I think we've all been complaining.
It might be Getz. It might be.
Yeah.
I mean, for all this, look, I every time I start talking positive about him, I always have to give the caveat of he's not the guy I would have chosen because I would have gone outside the organization. But like the good news is he was the guy in the organization that sat there and said, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know we got to find somebody in here that knows what they're doing, because then he went outside the organization and he keeps adding people. It's why he goes and he changes over the whole scouting department, brings in the guy from the Mets, and it's why Brian Bannister is running the pitching thing. I mean, there's a reason why you see the little moves this week and you go, well, that's Brian Bannister doing Brian Bannister things, right? Like he looked at Matt Foster and Jimmy Lambert and said, you guys don't really fit what we're doing. We're going to outright you. They chose free agency. Jimmy Lambert's been on the show before. It's a shame to see him go, but I mean, he doesn't fit. And then he's probably got a couple of guys on a list that he knows fit what he wants to do. And the Houston Astros waive Penn Murphy, who spells his name like a guy out of the hills of West Virginia.
Murfee.
Right, and Penn with two
He
N's.
spells it phonetically.
Right, exactly.
Phonetically is what I actually said there. So.
Tell me that he didn't grow up in Appalachia. I haven't looked him up yet. There's a good chance of it. But Penn Murphy, spelled Murfee, is now a right-handed pitcher claimed off of waivers and added to a 40-man roster. The positive that I'm hanging on to right now is not the Will Venable interviews, right? Like, you can miss me with any Will Venable interview. He's just going to say what every other manager, new coach in any sport is going to say. We're going to be more accountable. We're going to hustle. We're going to play hard. We're going to focus on defense. I mean, everybody says the same thing, right? We're going to be a different team.
Fundamentals.
Right. Fundamentals, all this stuff. We're going to score runs and we're going to change the way that things are. Every manager says that. I'm not criticizing him. I hope that when he says it, it's because that's what's going to happen. But until I see it, I'm at the point now where it's like, okay, I've heard that so many times before from so many other managers. Let's see it happen, right? Like, hopefully, after he's done with those interviews, he does things like evaluate his roster, have conversations with Getz, say things like, do we really need to give Andrew Vaughn way more money than what he should get in arbitration? Can't we go with something else here? Can you bring me in some help? I need a couple of professional hitters in this lineup. You have room in your cap, and you would still come in as the lowest salary in baseball, but you can spend $40 to $50 million here if you do the right thing and basically waive most of these ARB guys. And you could bring me a couple of professional hitters and maybe an anchor for this young pitching staff that you can kind of slide in there. It doesn't need to be a high-end free agent. Like, if anybody was offered a qualifying offer, take them off your list. The Sox aren't giving up a draft pick, but you can go and you can pull a few guys that either can become a base or become something that you flip, but he's going to need that. So as a manager, I hope he's having those conversations far more than the conversations in interviews. Those mean nothing to me. His conversations in interviews are just word salad. I hope that behind the scenes, we're getting more. And Getz has kind of shown me over the last year, even though he's made some mistakes with trades, that he at least has an understanding he needs to bring in people from outside organizations. He has to change the structure inside of the building. We're getting all these reports about people reporting to different people now and a different tree inside the building. He's really trying to make changes, and he's really trying to bring in other ideas. And that's something that this team lacked for decades. And that's the one positive right now that I'm holding on to. Sox in the Basement listeners, remember you can switch to a new age of life. Whether it's you, mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, you want to keep them out of assisted living? Go to Hyatt Home Medical Equipment and make it so they can get around on their own and live independently. Stair lifts, ramps, grab bars, lift chairs, and even bathroom remodeling. My mom is about to have a procedure done, and we were trying to figure out what would help her get around the house better, and I sent Dad up to Hyatt. They work with your insurance, and they give 0% financing to qualified individuals, CPAP machine users, unhappy with your vendor, switch, get your supplies directly mailed to you, and they even have the latest and greatest in continuous glucose monitors. Learn all about Hyatt Home Medical Equipment located on the southwest side at hhme.com. Your thoughts, Ed?
Well, and like you said, the proof is going to be in roster construction between Getz and Venable if there's changes. And I don't know that Will Venable's going and saying we don't need to pay Andrew Vaughn for this kind of money. But hopefully what he's doing is he's sitting there going, I watched this team. And I saw what you guys were while I was with the Rangers. I was doing some of the scouting, as we're getting ready for the team. And I can see this in this player that I want to fix. Can we do it? Or I don't like this guy. I don't like this player. I don't think he's good enough to be on my team. Can you get me something better? Right? I don't know that he's getting into the finances, but that's what I want Will Venable to be doing with Chris Getz, is to sit there and say, look, I like Lenyn Sosa. I like some of the things that I saw of him as I'm watching the video and as I'm watching the breakdowns and the scouting reports, but I don't love his defense. So I want to find a position for him, whether that's first base or DH. We're going to make a decision on this kid right now.
I mean, that's who I'd rather have at first base. I mean, we've kind of danced around it a little bit on this show, but if you give me Andrew Vaughn, Gavin Sheets, even Tim Elko and Lenyn Sosa, and you line them up and you tell me I want you to pick one to be a first baseman and one to be the other one that will rotate back and forth with DH. I'd rather have Sosa and Elko, and I'd really like to see Sosa get an opportunity to stand over there. Like, you know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of the move that was made with Luis Arias. Like, here's a guy who wins the batting title all the time, and he's been moved to first base even though he was a second baseman because of defense. And, sometimes as baseball fans will say, well, you got to be this big, hulking, tall, 6'5", 6'8" guy standing at first base. And you don't need that. And I think he would probably be a very good first baseman, and you'd like to keep the bat in play. And he was the only guy. I mean, honest to goodness, he was the only guy that I felt like last year gave me hope in the back end of the season, because when he got consistent at bats, finally, he performed well at the plate. And when you go back and you look at his baseball card through the minor leagues, it tells you, give him consistent at bats, run him out there and let him work through stuff without constantly pulling him from the order or changing his position constantly or doing whatever. Don't mess with him and let him sit there for a little bit and let him stew, and he will turn into something at the plate. And he did it at every level. And then for some reason, they wouldn't give him that time at the majors. And when he finally got it, because it was in the middle of the worst season ever, you saw him hit really well over, it was almost a 2-month period there at the end, where he was a hell of a hitter.
As we are going into the off season and going into this year, this time period where everyone's going to be sitting there going, okay, what's the hot stove and what's the rumors and what do you think is going to happen? What would you like to have happen? What kind of trades are you going to be able to pull off? Here's an idea for a trade. The thing to remember is, again, that what other teams perceive as being value for White Sox players and what the White Sox value may be two separate things. So Lenyn Sosa, as a guy that showed that he can hit and as a guy that has consistently shown that he can hit, becomes a much more valuable player than somebody with a high pedigree like Andrew Vaughn. And the reason for that is that show me, don't tell me at some point. And Vaughn, being a few years in, has not shown it. Sosa has started to show it, has a track record that suggests that maybe the end of the season was the start of something for him. And you can use that and parlay that into something else. So Sosa even becomes a trade candidate on that regard too. If you don't love his defense, but somebody else is going to sit there and go, yeah, I've seen what this kid does at every level, and I know he can hit. Maybe it's something that you can turn into a guy that you feel more comfortable with that is also going to provide offense, because that is still number one in my mind of what the White Sox need to do. They got to be able to hit next year. That you lost 121 games because you didn't score nearly enough runs and you couldn't sustain offense, and even your best hitters look bad in a lineup that was that grossly moribund.
You talk about pedigree. That's something that's always bothered me about how the White Sox evaluate players. Not every team does it the way that we have done it over the years. The idea of, well, he was a high draft choice, or he was projected high coming into the draft, so he's going to be good someday. And a lot of teams actually look at it the way they should look at it, which is, this is a higher probability pick. That's why we're taking that pick early, right? The probability he's going to be good is higher with this guy. That's why he was drafted, but he's not a guarantee. The low probability guy can very easily turn out to be the better player. And the Sox have always gotten themselves hung up on that. It was a Kenny Williams thing. It was why players were brought in past their prime, because they used to be good and he always wanted them. It's why guys were brought in if they were waived by a team after they had been a first-round draft choice and they had gotten plenty of opportunity, and it was like, well, we got to grab him because he's a first-round draft pick. That none of that matters. Once the guy is drafted and he's in your system, in my mind, if a guy is drafted in the first round and he plays shortstop, and you draft a shortstop in the 10th round and they show up, and over the course of a season, the 10th round guy turns out to be better than the first round guy, put your money on the 10th round guy and feel fortunate that the low probability guy had something that no scout was able to identify. Instead of being so stubborn that you're like, well, he was our first round pick, so we've got to just keep going with him. That's where the Vaughn argument is right now. The Vaughn argument is essentially, but look where we picked him. It isn't because of what he did. It isn't because of how he's performed. It isn't because you can't go out right now and find 10 of him sitting in the free agent market that are equal to or better than go out and fill that position for likely less money, or the same money if they're better than him, than what he would get in arbitration. It's the big hang up. And it's something that almost like the fan bases had kind of like beat into them, right? Over the years, it's been kind of beat into the fan base. You don't even realize it's happened to you. But that's not how the Tampa Bay Rays operate. You sit around and you look at them, they go, well, we drafted this guy, but this guy's a lot better. And that's the guy that's going to get the opportunity, and the other guy's going to sit down there. It drives fantasy baseball pundits crazy because they're like, well, the Rays have this player. He's really good. He's a high draft choice. Of course, he's going to be up this year. And the guy spends the whole year down in the minor leagues, and meanwhile, some other guy gets promoted in front of him. You and I have both seen that playing dynasty fantasy baseball with the Rays. They don't care what the pedigree is.
Yeah.
They take the guy who's good.
Yeah, exactly. And not just take the guy who's good, but watch the development, right? Every first round pick is a project. Almost none of them are major league ready when they walk in spite of the fact that the White Sox have done that on a couple of occasions with a pitcher. You can't tell me that Chris Sale, had he gone through a minor league season, couldn't have picked up something, or that Garrett Crochet, had he gone through a minor league season, might not have been stretched out and ready to start earlier in his career. Okay. That's probably a separate conversation. But the point of it is that 6th round shortstop and that 1st round shortstop, the 1st round shortstop comes out maybe more polished, has more skills in his game, or has the better athletic build, seems to have more tools. They always talk about the tools, right? And that 6th round guy might be a guy that comes in and sits there and goes, you know what? I got to get stronger. Let me get in the gym. I got to get faster. Let me do some training. I just learned how to better maximize my tools. I'm every bit the athlete the first round guy was, but I could never put the bat on the ball. Now I'm starting to figure it out. Or, if it's a pitcher, it's the same kind of a thing where first round guy might already throw in the 90s, sixth round guy might throw in the upper 80s. Well, sixth round guy puts together something in his mechanics where he's using his lower body better, or he does get stronger, or he does, improve his secondary arsenal. Now all of a sudden he might be the guy that sits there and goes, yeah, but sixth round guy gets every guy out. He does nothing but go out there and just fire bullets and get guys out. The first round guy walks everybody and hasn't gotten strikeouts from anyone because the overpowering fastball is the only thing he knows and it doesn't work. You see that all the time. It's why in the international market, going and throwing everything at Yoki Cespedes, right? When you might have passed up guys that are going to sit there and be nothing to speak of when we're looking at the scouting report, but get into the system and sit there and go, all right, I'm going to work my ass off and I'm going to do this. It's the stuff you can't quantify in the development that the White Sox have always lacked, because what we've heard is, here's our first round pick, here's our second round pick, here's the 5 prospects that we have that are going to make a huge difference. And by the way, we also have an entire farm system made up of apparently dead bodies, because that's all you ever hear about is the 5 guys, right? The 5 or 6 guys. That was the Kenny Williams, Rick Hahn method of it. And that in part is what has got to change too. So putting all your eggs into a first rounder's basket, or putting all your eggs into the basket of a prospect that has been hyped by the White Sox and that you've heard of, that's a mindset that Sox fans are going to have to break. We're going to have to go back to the kind of the olden days of not really knowing much about the prospects and just sitting there saying, okay, I hope they got something in the minors that will help us out, because it's just going to be one of those things where you're hopefully as a fan so inundated with all these guys are kind of the same, and all of these guys could progress the same, and all these guys have an opportunity that I can't keep track of who's who, and then you leave it to guys like James Fox to tell us, like, this guy's on the rise.
Sox in the Basement listeners trying to make the most of your money, give a call to Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor. Located on the corner of 111th and Kedzie, but serving the Chicagoland area, Tom has a get-to-know-you approach and a do-the-right-thing attitude. He's been doing this for decades. It's all about knowing your options when you're investing and planning for your retirement. No matter what stage you are at, it costs nothing to check in with Tom. Give Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor, a call today, 773-779-0023. Edward Jones, member SIPC. If you're a big stats guy, if you love the metrics, the perfect example is go back to the original book Moneyball and read the description of what happened to now the departed Billy Beane. And, who was the guy who the book was written about and what they did out in Oakland. He was a 5-tool player drafted, I believe, in the first round. I'm going to bring it up.
I believe so. I think Billy Beane was a high draft pick.
Billy Beane was drafted in the first round. Yes, he was drafted in the first round by the New York Mets, 23rd overall in the 1980 MLB June Amateur Draft. He was a 5-tool player. He was the pedigree. And he admits that mentally he just could not get over himself. The amount of pressure he put on himself, when he finally got to where he was at, he couldn't get across the threshold. It wasn't a lack of skill. It wasn't that the numbers were lying about him. It wasn't that the scouts were wrong. He just didn't have it. And he wasn't able to get over his failures, and he ended up not making it. Now, he's a first-round pick. He's exactly what, the White Sox of old would go out and grab once he was waived. Well, look at him. He was 23rd overall.
In fact, they might have. Did Billy Beane ever play for the White Sox? I wouldn't be shocked.
I don't know. Wouldn't that be amazing? He did play around the league. He did not play for the White Sox. He had Mets, then he did the Twins, then he was at the Tigers, and then he was with the A's, and then he was out of baseball. He did make it to the majors. He didn't play very well. He was a negative B-WAR in every year except for 2 of them where he was a 0.0. He was just... It didn't work out for him. And by his own admission, it wasn't that he didn't have the skills. He just wasn't able to put it together. He was a high probability pick. But once you've got the guy in the system, then you just have to evaluate him on what is he. It's the same thing with football drafts. Same thing with every sport. I think most franchises in most sports have this issue where they have a very hard time giving up on the first round draft pick when the first round draft pick has shown that he can't do it. But they'll give up on the fifth round guy who's actually performed better quicker because of where he was drafted at. And I think the best GMs and the best evaluators actually sit there and say, no, he really was worth that pick. We couldn't have got him in any other round. And we expected him to be good. But guess what? He doesn't have it. It's time to go do that again or figure out another plan at that position. And I think the most successful organizations in any sport do it that way. And so that you talk about change. We talked about, well, who do we go to for change? And I keep going back to, well, right now, I think the person you go talk to for change is Getz because he keeps changing what he's doing in there. And you hope one of the things they're going to do in terms of their evaluation, especially of the minor leagues, and this is something he should be able to do. If he hasn't figured this out yet, he'll probably never figure it out. But he was around the minor league system. He watched the guys that were placed there, and he was told, this guy's a higher pedigree than this guy. This guy's more important than this guy. And you hope that also annoyed him, that he sat there and said, that shouldn't matter. There's a point where you're either good or you're bad. You're either part of the plan or you're not part of the plan. Your draft selection and where you were drafted at should not rank you in a minor league system after year one. Once you've gone through year one and we've gotten a real good look at you, you are what you are. You have a list of things that we're working on with you, and we're hoping that we develop you. And if you don't pan out, whatever, you were just a pick. Because if you're running your minor league system well, Ed, right, you should be able to find that guy that you drafted in the 5th, 6th, 10th round and develop him. And then it wouldn't hurt so much if the first round guy didn't work out. The problem is the Sox are never really good at that. So that's why they just hang with the first round guys way too long. So when we talk about like what's going to change in the organization, I want to see that change. It's that thing. Like I don't have much to grasp onto here in the offseason, but that's why I'm watching so closely as to what they do with their arbitration. Because if they just bring everybody back who didn't perform, then what you're telling me is nothing's changing on that front. And that is a negative. That is one of the reasons why teams don't make it to the top of the mountain, because they fall short in these little areas. And that's a little area that needs to be addressed.
Well, and the development, and that's where I think when people get there on Getz is they're, well, you were the guy that was supposed to do this, but he really wasn't though, right? Because he's in charge of player development, but then he's handcuffed by what the bosses tell him.
He's following whatever plan was given to him. And
whatever the plan was. Right. So the real issue is that we're not going to know Chris Getz's developmental plans for a while, but Brian Bannister, we brought his name up a couple of times. Brian Bannister being there as the pitching guru tells you something about player development, because it tells you that there's going to be an organizational wide look at how pitchers come up. And already we've seen some of that, because what is their greatest strength right now with young players and with guys in the organization that we think can contribute in 2025 without going into the free agent market? It's pitchers, right? They can put together a rotation and a bullpen right now that you'd sit there and go, they got a pretty decent chance. They could use more. There's no doubt about it. If you can get some star power there, if you can get some stability there, there's no doubt about it. They could use help. But you can't say the same thing about hitters, and you can't say the same thing about fielders. So that's where the development comes in.
Let me ask you a question. We got a message through soxinthebasement.com. You can leave voice messages. You can also, type one out if you want to. Gene reached out and very nicely, before he criticized me, said, Chris, this podcast is the best by far of all Sox podcast. And the moment somebody starts one like that, I'm like, they're going to tell us they don't agree with us on something.
What did we do wrong now?
We did something wrong. And what he complains about is he doesn't agree with us saying that Will Venable should get to pick everybody on his staff. That if Brian Bannister really is developing something in a system, then Venable should have to take on somebody that fits what Bannister's doing. And you know what? I agree with that. I think where we disconnect with Gene, or where I might not have got my point across, Katz was not Bannister's.
No.
And so I would like in the case of pitching staff, right? Like, let's think about what I said in the last show, like Venable or whatever manager should get to be able to bring in the guys that are going to work well with him. That's understanding that like Venable was interviewed and agrees with what the team is trying to do, right? Like if they brought in Will Venable and Will Venable's like, yep, thanks for the job. I disagree with everything you're doing here. I'm going to do my own thing. They did a terrible job interviewing, and we're screwed.
That doesn't work out at all for anybody.
It doesn't work out at all. So the hope is that Venable is on the same page as what they're doing. And you're right. If they change pitching coaches, it's going to be somebody that Bannister's happy with, and you would hope it's somebody that Venable's happy with. I just kind of feel like Katz isn't necessarily the guy. Like, my fear is that Katz is kept around because Jerry Reinsdorf signed him to a deal and says, well, we don't get rid of coaches till their contracts run out, which is something you've heard about. And those are the things that need to change inside of the building if that's the case. So unless like Bannister got there, looked at Katz and said, by the way, you've been doing this wrong. And Katz was like, you're right, I have been doing this wrong. He would be a candidate to probably be moved on from. That was the point that I was trying to make, because you got to remember, Katz was a very different way of pitching. Katz was look at what this team was before Bannister got there. Like, there's been new pitches introduced into the repertoire of the pitchers. And they've kind of changed how they attack the batters. We've had guests on to talk about it, and I don't want to pretend that I'm going to get it right, but it is something that's been broken down on this show before. That didn't come from Katz. Katz had years to get that set up. He wasn't doing that. So he may not fit the system, and that's why I would think that. But I do get Gene's point. I understand that. You're right. But my assumption is Will Venable comes walking in, Ed, and he's probably in lockstep. Would you agree?
Oh, well, yeah. I think one of the things to remember, too, is that Ethan Katz, just like Don Cooper before him, was a guy that was a holdover between staffs. And when you get that holdover, you assume that there's some reason for that. And in the case of Ethan Katz, a lot of us look at him and go, what is it exactly you do for a living, Mr. Katz? Because the pitchers, that he were supposed to have helped, he couldn't get over the hump. He never really got Dylan Cease over the hump. Cease kind of got himself there. And Lucas Giolito was fixed, but then he regressed. And he came in and he said he had reasons to believe Ronaldo Lopez was going to be able to fix a mechanical issue that was going to help him. And not that Ronaldo was bad, but he went to the Braves and was better. And so it's one of those where you pick on Ethan Katz mainly because as a holdover, you sit there and go, yeah, but what did you do that allowed you to keep the job? Now, they both come from the Giants organization. Bannister might have sat there and said, okay, I trust what Ethan's doing because I think that this is the guy I want, and maybe that's why he sticks around. And that is, that's the point that you and I didn't make, okay? But at the same time, if Will Venable is presented with, here's what we're looking for in a pitching coach, here's the philosophy, there's these 3 or 4 guys that are out there that will go along with this philosophy and we think will work well with the pitchers. We recommend these names. Who do you like? And Venable gets a chance to sit there and go, okay, these are the guys I want. Then that's a good thing. And that's the kind of positive change I think we would be looking for. If Will Venable is being told as he walks in, you're keeping Ethan Katz, okay? You're keeping Grady Sizemore. You're keeping, everybody on the coaching staff. You don't get to pick anyone. That's not a good thing. And so far from what we've seen from the initial interviews with Getz after the hire, it sounds like Will Venable is going to have a very big voice in what happens with his coaching staff, which is great. But if Venable, Getz, and Bannister and Barfield, if the entire front office and the field manager are in lockstep, then any changes, any hires that are made on the coaching staff will be in keeping with what Chris Getz wants out of the team, what Brian Bannister wants out of the pitchers, what they are looking to do fundamentally as an organization and the type of team they want. Venable, Getz, everybody involved has got to be on that same page.
Socks in the basement. Socks in the basement. Socks in the basement.
Socks in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found and always on socksinthebasement.com.